Thanks everybody for coming. We tried to put stuff together to give you as much information as possible. It's hard in a half an hour to cover everything I want to cover. So I'll go through some things kind of quickly and focus a little bit more on others. I have a lot of handouts over there and I'll try to talk about what's available as I go through. So I just want to start with a little bit about bats. Most people know very little about bats. Even as a wildlife major in undergrad, I had a tiny introduction to them and really knew nothing specific. And I'm not going to get into big details about it, but bats are mammals just like us, and they really are the only true flying mammal. There are other mammals that glide. There are over 1,000 species worldwide, and they have a wide variety of different types of bats and different specialties in what they eat and how they fly and how they echolocate. We're going to focus on the bats in Georgia today. One of the really interesting things about bats, they're in the order Chiroptera, and that actually means hand wing. And this is a great photo to show you how a bat's wing is just a modified human arm and hand. You can see that there's a thumb and 4 fingers, an elbow, a forearm, and everything's connected by skin. And the skin membranes are connected to each of those joints and bones, so that forms that full wing for the bat to be able to fly. So it's really cool when you have a bat in your hand and you can show people that it's just, it's furry like we are, and it has live young, and it has basically the same parts, just modified. We have 16 species of bats in Georgia. A lot of people don't realize we have that many. Some of them are limited to certain parts of the state, and we'll go over that. I have posters available over there. If you guys want one, you can pick one up. All of our bats in Georgia eat exclusively insects, so that's what they're eating. And if people tell you they found a fruit bat, it's a crazy thing if they really did. So we don't have fruit bats in Georgia, but they do a very good thing by eating insects. So I want to quickly go over all the species and kind of where they are and what they look like briefly. I can't give you species ID in this kind of talk, but what I did do is I brought a key to the bats in Georgia that gives you a lot of characteristics of each species. I know a lot of times when people find bats, either rehabilitators or people that find them in attics, they're almost always a little brown bat. Well, almost all of our bats are little and brown, so that doesn't really help. And that isn't really a bat's name. I mean, it's a little brown bat, we have a big brown bat, but there's a big difference between them. I'll try to cover the difference between little brown and big brown a little bit to help you. But the main thing to tell between the bats with the significant difference is the forearm measurement. So if you can get that can help you really narrow down what species it is. And then there's other descriptive features on the sheet. So grab one if you have any issues with bats and you're trying to figure out which one it is. These are gray bats. This is a bat that's an endangered species. It's only found in the northwestern part of the state. We've got some new records north central, so it's definitely a North Georgia specific species. This is one of the cave bats. We kind of have bats grouped as cave or tree bats. And this species is unique in that it uses caves both in the winter time for hibernation and in the summer for maternity colonies to raise young. And they split into bachelor colonies. The males get kicked out and spend their summer in caves as well. But that's unusual. Most bats that spend their winters in caves don't spend summers in caves. Another species that does that is the southeastern myotis. This is a Georgia species of concern. It's in only the southern part of Georgia. And it is another myotis species these are all very similar species. They're hard to tell apart. And these two are not species that you would probably run into very often in people's homes. The southeastern myotis will get into homes occasionally, but it isn't restricted to the southern part of the state. So you probably wouldn't see it unless you were in South Georgia. Another cave species is the Indiana bat. This bat is the beginning of the bats that hibernate in caves in the winter and then come out onto the landscape in the summer. These bats are endangered partially because they've been disturbed in caves for a long time, which is a major issue for bats, but also they have very specific requirements for their maternity roosts, and their males also roost in the summer under the bark of trees. And the bark is coming off. They used to roost under emergent trees that came out of the canopy and died, and the bark was falling off and they would jam up underneath. They want to be really hot and great sun exposure. Well, with timber harvesting and all the changes on the landscape, you don't have nearly as many large emergent trees dying in the canopy. So that's caused them not to have as much good summer habitat. And they'll also, lose roosts during the summer. So they've had a lot of issues. Another species that uses caves in the winter and is out on the landscape in the summer is the big brown bat. And this is probably the most common bat that people in this area have in their attic. And they usually get 10 to 20 bats. These guys usually don't come in in huge numbers. We are getting a lot more free-tailed bats in houses now. I'll talk more about them later, but when someone has a small bat problem, it's usually big brown bats. These guys are not very big. They still have a relatively small body size, and again, you can look at the sheet and kind of get an idea of size. But they have pretty big teeth, and they have glands on their nose. You can see that this is kind of swollen up on their muzzle. And their teeth are large because they specialize in eating beetles. So if you look at those teeth, I think this bat looks like a dog, and it has really big teeth. And when you look at a little brown, they're much smaller, they're pretty tiny, they fit in your hand easily, and they are going to be ferocious just like the big brown bat, but their teeth are tiny. They'll still draw blood and they'll try to bite you, but you can tell the difference between those two just by looking at their mouth. They're significantly smaller, and the forearm measurement will tell you right away whether it's a big brown or not, because they have a very large forearm compared to the other small Myotis species. But it's a big difference between these two, and they're commonly mistaken just because people get a brown bat in their hand and it's not big, so they think it must be a little brown bat. There are other cave bats that use caves in the winter and come out in the summertime. The tricolored bat is probably the most common bat we have on the landscape, widespread throughout Georgia. You'll see this one in houses as well on occasion, but it's usually one bat or two bats. If you've ever been to the gold mines in Dahlonega, this is the bat that's there. They have a very pink forearm, and they're the ones that get very frosty in the wintertime when they're hibernating. We also have northern long-eared and small-footed Myotis. The small-footed Myotis is our smallest bat, and it's about the size of your thumb. And those two you don't normally find in situations in houses. The Brazilian free-tailed bat is the only bat we have that has a tail that extends beyond the tail membrane, and it has crazy folds on its face and really unique ears. It's definitely different than any other bat we have, and you should be able to tell that one right away. If you see a tail, and you can almost always see them, you can tell which bat it is. And this bat is spreading further north. It's the same bat that's found in large numbers in places like Texas and Bracken Cave, but it doesn't really use caves in Georgia. It's more of a building occupying species. In Texas, they go to Mexico in the wintertime and come back to Texas. And here they're sort of year-round in places that are warm enough. So they'll often switch roosts to go to places that are heated and cause a lot of problems for people. And if you've read in the paper, these guys have been on the news because they will form large colonies in people's homes and in buildings. And they're spreading their range out as things get warmer. So they're definitely becoming more of a problem. Now we're going to move on to the tree bats. These bats are almost never found in caves. On the left is the red bat. It's probably the most common eastern tree bat, and the right is the Seminole bat. It's more restricted to the coastal plain area. These bats are out on the landscape roosting by themselves. They're solitary, so they never form colonies, and they might just be a mother and her young, or just by herself or a male. And they kind of hide and try to look like a dead leaf. So when you see bats that seem to come out of nowhere, that's probably tree bats that are just hanging out in your neighborhood. And these bats, we didn't really know what they did in the wintertime. They do migrate. Most of the tree bats are migratory to some degree. And they will, the red bats that live in the north will come down south. And actually, we figured out while we were prescribed burning, we would see bats flying out from under the leaf litter and realize that those were red bats, and they will go under leaf and pine needle litter to just get a layer of insulation during cold snaps, and they just need to not freeze. They're very much, these tree bats have a lot more fur. They have fur on their tail, thicker fur, a lot of fur on their head, really thick necks, so that they can stay warm because they never hibernate. They'll go into a torpor in cold periods, but they won't truly hibernate. Here's some more bats that use cavities as well as just hanging out singly in trees. The northern yellow bat is a species that we're studying a little bit more. It's more coastal plain exclusive, and it uses Spanish moss clumps to roost in. And we don't know a lot about this species, but we've got a graduate student working on a project on the coast, and we're learning a lot more. This is our largest bat, the hoary bat. This bat has a 16-inch wingspan. They tend to fly high above large bodies of water. They're pretty much the toughest bat that we have, and they're across North America. And this species migrates long distances, and they can definitely stay active very often. So they can be out when it's pretty cold. They have very thick fur. And our biggest eared bat is the Raphanus big-eared bat. This species is considered rare. It kind of has two different habitat types. It lives in the coastal plain of Georgia in bottomland hardwood forest, in hollow, big tupelo and cypress trees. If you guys know anything about that habitat, it's not very common anymore. The best place for this species in Georgia is along the Altamaha River floodplain. We have preserved some areas there with huge hollow trees, and these guys need pretty big hollow trees. They'll raise their young in hollow trees, and they will be out on the landscape. They'll use trees all year round and just kind of switch to different tree types in the winter. They also live in the northern part of their range, is in the north part of Georgia. They're really kind of non-existent in the Piedmont, and there they'll be in caves and mines, both in the summer and in the winter time. So I want to talk a little bit about why bats are beneficial. It used to be that everybody thought bats were pests and there wasn't really any good, and they needed to be killed, like a lot of other things that were considered a nuisance. But we know that bats eat a lot of insects. One bat can eat half to their entire body weight in insects in a night, which is incredible. If you think about you eating what you weigh and then trying to fly around, and a lot of them are pregnant when they're doing this, it's really unbelievable. And 1,000 bats in a colony, like little brown bats, which sounds like a lot, but in body size is not that much, can eat 22 pounds of insects in a night. That's an incredible amount of insects. And they can help control crop pests. This is an example of an ear of corn that was eaten by a corn earworm moth. And the bats love this moth, and they will eat them in large numbers, especially the free-tailed bats out in Texas. So without bats, they would be a huge problem for agriculture. And there was a recent study that was completed that kind of went over the economic importance of bats in light of all the things that are impacting them. And they estimated that if bats were lost, it would cost agriculture more than $3.7 billion a year in pest control. So that's a huge issue if bats are lost. And there is the paper that was printed in Science is also over there talking about the economic importance of bats if you guys are interested. Another issue is biological control. I haven't really heard this very much, but we have a farmer in Quitman, Georgia, and South Georgia that had a pecan farm and wanted to go organic and decided to try to put up some bat houses and see if he could get bats to eat his insects. And he put up one and it immediately got filled with free-tailed bats. And so he just kept putting them up, and he was able to go completely organic using the bats. At some point, he used the guano as fertilizer for the trees. And those bats, the Tifton campus of UGA has been doing some studies to look at where they're foraging and what impact they're having on the surrounding landowners. And they're having a big impact on insect control, not just on his farm, but all around. So this is a good thing to promote when we're talking about how we can use these species to our benefit. Providing them with a roost and then getting a great benefit of pest control is amazing. Other than insect eating, bats do a lot of things around the world, and a big thing is pollination. And all of these products we wouldn't have without bats. And there's many more. There's a huge long list of things bats pollinate and are important, a very critical part of the life cycle of many plants. And we tend to forget this. We always think about bees as pollinators, so we know bees are having problems too. Bats are important pollinators and they're having problems. So if you see these trends, you're seeing that a lot of these things that are very important economically to us are in danger because we're losing these species that are required in the life cycle of these plants. Other things we get from bats, most of the people think of guano as a bad thing. Nobody wants it in their house, but a lot of people harvest it, and it can go for quite a high price on the internet. If you have a contained bat colony that's in a good place, you can harvest the guano and sell it or use it on your own garden. It makes great fertilizer. It's just insect parts, so it's a really good fertilizer that people have been using forever. So that's one thing that can be beneficial even though you don't want it in large quantities in your house. Bats are also important as food sources for other animals. This is not a U.S. species, this is vampire bats. But we see this all the time in Georgia, especially rat snakes will stick their tail in a crack in a cave entrance and grab bats flying out of the cave and eat them. Raccoons, owls, hawks, many things eat bats, so they're important that way. And this is a situation, has anybody ever been to the Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin? Good, a couple of people. So in Austin, Texas, they built this bridge right in downtown, and right after they built it, free-tailed bats moved in crazy amounts. It was just an incredible number of bats, and the city was freaking out because all of a sudden they had all these bats in downtown Austin. Luckily, Bat Conservation International has their home in Austin and kind of was like, wait, slow down, why is this really a bad thing? I mean, the bridge is built for bats, they're not doing anything but roosting there. So the city started to see if they could, not really do anything about it, and what would happen? And it became a huge attraction. Almost everyone that goes to Austin visits the bridge. You can go buy bat souvenirs on the bridge. You can take a bat cruise, and people will be out. It's amazing the numbers of people that are out at night to watch the bats coming out, because it's one of the most urban places you can see this many bats at one time. So the city really turned it around, and it's become a very popular tourist attraction. So that's a way bats can be beneficial as well.